welcome to Incorruptible Mass. We are here to make sure that we can all transform state politics. We know that we could have a state legislature and state regulations and rules and laws that truly benefit the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we are talking about the budget. We are going to be covering a little bit about the governor's proposed budget. We're talking about where that money comes from, how things are getting paid for, as well as, can things be changed in the middle of the year? Like what happens next? How do we compare with other states? So deep dive into the budget with an amazing special guest from the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. But before we introduce that person, I will introduce my two regulars. And I will start with Jonathan.
Jonathan Cohn, kind of he, him, his, joining from Boston, and I've been active in different issue and electoral campaigns here in Massachusetts for over a decade and now, which always feels wild for me to say.
And Jordan.
My name's Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him, and I have several years experience in Massachusetts politics, and I had the pleasure of also being on the Mass Budget Board for that.
And I'm Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Very excited to do all sorts of local politics as well as statewide politics for quite a number of years. And today we have as an amazing special guest, Phineas, I'm sorry, I forgot to ask you the pronunciation of your last name before we started. That was the thing I wanted to ask you. Baxandall, did I say that right?
You got it.
Wonderful. From the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, can you just talk a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work, and then about the organization you're with?
Yeah. Wow. So thank you for being here, for having me here. So my path to being a Mass Budget, where I'm the interim president, I'll go back to being policy director there, but is through academia. I would describe myself as a recovering academic, and I was once one of those totally starry-eyed people who thought that being an academic meant, some way that it was a channeling to being a public intellectual, actually changing the world, as opposed to kind of fighting over obscure journals that nobody else read. And I got somewhat disillusioned by that and moved into a policy world by a variety of steps. And Mass Budget is, we've been around for 36 years or so, being a think tank that's really focused on improving policy for Massachusetts, with a particular eye towards advancing equity, racial and economic equity for the Commonwealth.
Amazing. And we are so grateful for the work you do. Really, it is fantastic. So first, I would love it if you could just put in your own words why our state budget is important and why people might ignore it or have their eyes glaze over.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'll do that in two parts. The first part is, I think to some extent, the budget doesn't get ignored, at least within political insiders, because it's the one piece of legislation that everyone knows has to pass. Even though people may wring their hands about it passing late, it's the one thing which is going to happen. So everyone tries to use it as a kind of vehicle to attach their other things. So in that way, it has a kind of outsized importance. But I think that can obscure the real importance about the state budget. Is if we think of it as budgets are not just a bunch of numbers that list the value of money going somewhere. They are values in a more moral sense, that they are, how much we are giving to the state police or child hunger says something about how we are prioritizing about these things. It's one thing to always be like, oh yeah, we care about this and we want that. But where the kind of, rubber hits the road is how much resources are you willing to give to those priorities, Anna?
Can I just jump in with something? Because I lived in California for a couple of years, and I remember somebody showing me a California state budget over the course of 10 years where you could literally just look at the budget for education and the budget for prisons. And the amount of money that had been gone down, that education had gone down, was the exact same amount of money that prisons had gone up. And it was like, that was the values that they were doing.
Yeah.
So we really can think about these things in terms of the values that we share. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. No, you're totally spot on, and it's that I think sometimes people think of budgets as something more complicated just because there's a lot of numbers, but fundamentally, the state budget is how we bring together the resources to accomplish the things that we can't accomplish individually. Whether it's roads or clean waters or schools, any of that, whatever it is, it's the budget. And for activists who might be listening to your podcast, also, I think everyone has had the experience where you have a conversation with some decision maker who tells you, well, we might like to do that, but it's a budget thing. And we at Mass Budget, we sort of see part of our job as being like, when someone says, oh, it's a budget thing, that should be the beginning of the conversation. Like, oh, it's a budget thing. Well, let's talk about where the revenue's coming or how you could do this or that, instead of like, oh, it's a budget thing, end of conversation.
I just wanted to quickly take, and I really like kind of how you were framing the budget as basically how we marshal our collective resources to meet our collective needs as a society.
Yeah.
Great. And I want to ask you about, apparently Governor Healy has released a budget. Do you have anything about that you want to share with us about the total numbers or about, changes from last year?
Yeah. So it's a $56 billion budget, which is so an increase from what was a $54 billion budget that was passed last year. There are smaller supplements tend to get passed during the year if there's money to do that, and we can talk about that. But basically, this is the action for how resources get allocated. And when you ever compare one year to another, it's always good to say, well, what's inflation? Is it outpacing inflation? Is the value of it, the what it can buy, increasing or not? And here, the increase, if you adjust for what inflation is anticipated, it's an increase of less than 1% from last year, and most of that increase is coming from the Fair Share Amendment, where they're anticipating more money than they were very cautious about it the first year of that money, and now they're anticipating more money of it. So that's a 30% increase in fair share money. The non-fair share money, the non-fair share spending in the budget actually goes down about 0.5% in this budget proposal, I should say.
Yeah. And interestingly, we've covered a little bit of this in the last few episodes, that the fair share, the amount that the fair share was bringing in was almost completely the same amount that was cut by tax cuts. So are there other places where this extra revenue is coming from, or am I not looking at it in the right way?
So, I think in this budget, the fair share money is anticipated at $1.3 billion, which is more than the tax cut, which is about $1 billion. So if you look at those two together, we're now in the plus zone from the fair share money. I do think, for people who had been listening to the governor talking about, oh, we're gonna, double operational support for the MBTA, or we're gonna do this for early ed, or that for higher ed, or whatnot. There's a real question of, well, given that revenues have been lower than expected for 6 months, and there was this tax cut, where is that money going to come from? And that was a real sort of question coming into this.
Just to tag in, so where did the money come going into this? Right, to your point, we're noting that the budget as itself, the size of the budget has increased, as it tends to on a year-to-year, just based on like a state grows in population, it grows in need. The budget needs to grow accordingly, and if you want to do anything additional, it needs to grow, and that that revenue projections were lower than expected, and the legislature cut money, including the tax cuts. So all of that the pot of the money from fair share grew from last year, but that there was still, to meet that needed growth, that there would be need to get additional resources from somewhere. So how does the math work in the governor's budget?
Where does the money come? And so we were kind of honestly skeptical, sort of where is this coming from? And there's some, some of the things are just, there's less people because of federal rules who are on mass health. And so that ends up, mass health is really costly. So there's some savings there. Another major area, Anna, go on.
Thank you. I just had a little question about that. So you say
Yeah.
Mass health is really costly. Like, are we talking a quarter of the budget, a third of the budget? Like, mass health is
So
what is
I
it?
wish this was a simple question. So
Ah,
if you go to the budget browser at Mass Budget, which I encourage people to do, you'll see that health is huge. It's almost like 40%, but that's
wow.
actually a grand overestimate, because most of that money gets reimbursed. That's money which the state pays out, and then most of that, 70-80% pandemic, can even be a little higher from that, gets reimbursed. So we actually have a study that'll come out this year trying to say, well, if you look at it, accounting that, how big is it? And last time we did this study a few years ago, it was, I think, 28%. So it's still biggest thing in the budget, but not swallowing the whole budget the way you sometimes hear about.
But I was not far off when I said a quarter.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes.
Yeah. So one part of it is the savings from mass health. There are some other kind of accounts where there was money from the pandemic. All this federal aid created surpluses that are being used. And then we also have absolutely the biggest rainy day fund we ever had from those surpluses. It's a combination of the temporary surpluses from federal pandemic money and the economy doing well, and us having some years of very large stock market gains, where one of the biggest feeders into the rainy day fund is capital gains, which is a lot about taxes and real estate money. And the rainy day fund has now gotten so that it's getting towards $9 billion, which is a whole lot of money. And so what the Haley administration proposed is, we're not going to draw from that money, but instead of having all of the kind of excess beyond a certain threshold capital gains go automatically into further swelling that rainy day fund, we'll draw most of that extra money will make available to the budget. So these are the kinds of things, they're not tricks. They're some of them are kind of usable in the future, some of them are less usable, but they are the kind of answer to the riddle of how do you collect less money and spend more money.
I'm just going to ask for comments from the peanut gallery here, because I think it was interesting to chat about this beforehand and see that, actually these are sort of valid places.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's hard, right? Because I think there's not, we've been very critical of the tax cuts, as well we should be. And but there were some good things in them that helped other folks. I think especially when we think about the earned income tax credit, I think that's one that we all agree is really important, and there's some pieces, but ultimately I think our frustration is that there's just so many things that we need to do to make this state more affordable, to make childcare, which is totally unaffordable, rein it back in. The MBTA is a mess and in crisis, and we could all there's some schools in Worcester that are hundreds of over 100 years, or there's just things that we need to do. And so you could not say that what is actually the most important is day traders getting a tax cut based on all the things we need. But I do think what's exciting is that there's some really good things in this budget that is being proposed by the governor that do some of the things we want, and there's some ways that she's paying for it that make a lot of good fiscal sense that maybe a different governor wouldn't have made. I think it's important we give that credit, and also I think we have to balance it with there was just some needless tax cuts that are going to be forever. They're not, unless we figure out how to roll them back, they are going to continue, not just this budget, not just next budget, but forever. And we're always going to be trying to figure out ways around it when we could just have that revenue, and the day traders literally wouldn't notice a difference. A dead billionaires and billionaires definitely don't notice the difference, whether or not they can pass down the money that they've made. So like that's the problem, right? Is it's like it's all these are ultimately choices, as we said from the get-go. Like it's a statement of our values.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here and say that, budgets are important. Funding things that matter this is very important to fund things that matter. We hope that you will take a moment right now to hit pause, look at the link below, pop in there, and you can donate to the show. Right? This show matters in terms of your ability to hear these stories that you will not hear this analysis anywhere else, and for us to build a progressive movement that is informed and that can take action together. So please do pop us over with $5, $100, $1,000, any amount is good. It all goes towards our, wonderful, young, passionate, a few people who work on this show, making sure that we have graphics and editing, video editing, and all of these sorts of things. So none of it goes to us. That's maybe a different fund we can set up. But just wanted to go ahead and say that. And now we're going to turn it back over to Phineas Baxandall to talk a little bit about what happens now? Like what is going to be the next step?
Well, if I can, I want to just call out a few things about this budget, which I think really are notable. One of them are there were real advances that were made during the pandemic, things like free school meals and subsidies for child care providers, which a lot of states are pulling back from, and really because of the fair share money that was made available from the ballot initiative. Massachusetts is in this budget now for 2 years in a row, keeping those things around. So that's something which is really, really worth celebrating as something which was made possible by fair share. There's also some things that are in this budget which are not huge spending items or even zero spending items, but which are also worth celebrating. Access to counsel. People who are being evicted, low-income renters or owner-occupiers would have some access to counsel. So that's something which is really important. People have been asking for a long time, and is an outside section of this budget language. Similarly, the prison in Concord would be closed under this budget, not just saving $16 million a year, but shifting us a little bit away from that kind of carceral industrial complex. So those are some things which I couldn't leave without saying. These are things which I really hope people can help keep in this budget as it keeps moving on. The way this budget will keep moving on is that next, the House Ways and Means Committee in April will come up with its budget proposal, which will be followed quickly by a vote in the House for a final House proposal. And then the same thing will happen in the Senate with the Senate Ways and Means, and then the two will then conference as they'll have their differences, and then the governor can veto some things. The veto can get overrode. In theory, this will all happen before the new 2025 fiscal year starts on July 1st. In practice, it may take even a couple months longer for that to happen. But that's the road ahead. Lots of opportunities for people to go in and tell their legislators, hey, this is really important to keep. Hey, this is something we want to see more of, etc.
Wonderful. And if it turns out that this, for example, we're into the budget and then revenues actually change or get worse or get better in unexpected ways, is it possible to change the budget? How do things happen like that?
Yeah, there's usually two now. There's kind of three ways where this will change. If revenues go really south, if we're not bringing in as much money happens, we could have another round of what we saw in 2024, which was cuts, unexpected cuts that get called 9C cuts, because that's where in the statute it is. And that would be, that could be really bad for a lot of programs. If
to remind our listeners, that means what you do is you're never required to cut. We talked about this before. So you're required to look at what programs you can cut, but you're never required to look at what taxes you can
Right.
increase.
It's never one. It's only one direction. We only
Yeah.
cut things. We don't restore recently cut taxes. Let's say on day traders, which could cover a lot of these 9-cent cuts. Not all of them, but certainly we could have cuts. We could have like eased some of that pain.
Yeah,
That's
or
right.
like basically have things go on like a suspension of certain things one if the numbers don't work in the budget.
Right, like it's not possible to say we're going to start charging sales tax on private jets now because we're in the middle. Something like that can't just, happen. Um, due to the rules of it. The other thing that could happen is if there's more revenue available than anticipated, then there will be a supplementary budget. And there's been a lot of that in years, and that can be a real opportunity for good agendas to get advanced. And there's a special place where the fair share money, because there's a real delay in how much fair share money they know. So from the first year, the 2023 taxes, that's not going to be really until sometime after October are they going to know how much more than the $1 billion was raised, and that will be an opportunity for that additional fair share money to get spent out on education and transportation.
And Phineas, could you take kind of a few moments to talk about the use of fair share money in the current budget cycle, so that the governor in her proposal decided to allocate that $1.3 billion to specific programs. The legislature might change those when when the House and Senate put together their budget, et cetera, et cetera. But any new kind of things in her proposal that you were particularly excited about?
I don't know, say excited about one way or the other. I mean, the first time the fair share money was the spending was out there, they were pretty 50-50 between transportation and education. This time there's more education than transportation. It's 42%, 58%, something like that. But they've moved away from this trying to have 50-50. And then the other thing that they're doing, which is different, is not all of it is for immediate spending. Some of it is to be creating to pay back bonds that they're going to issue for long-term investments, which will get paid back over 20 years or so, which hopefully could address, for instance, things like your school building in Worcester that you were talking about that would probably be paid for with bonds.
Okay, I know you have to go. So I have one final question, and I'll let you pick the question. So you can either compare us with other states, because we talked a little bit about that before we started recording, or if you want to talk a little bit about what if we wanted to do some of these bigger policies that would cost more money, where would revenue like that come from?
Well, to some extent, I already spoke just really briefly about other states. The states that were cutting back income taxes and such are in real trouble now. Fair share has us even thinking about expanding, about new aspirations in a way that's really exciting. This is, as the administration has characterized this, as a kind of bridge to additional revenues in the future. And some of that can happen perhaps from just normal growth. But if we really want to be visionary, as you say, if we want to do, not just community college being free for people who are over 25, but we want to say all community college, maybe all for low-income people, all college, free, those type of things, those types of really game-changing visionary things will eventually need more revenue. And, where that will come from, there's no shortage of possibilities. One thing, where the federal government has been making sort of things pointing towards is being able to recapture some of the money that gets lost from multinational corporations doing offshore tax dodging, using kind of like offshore tax shelters. And the federal government has begun to create some infrastructure for beginning to do that and look at that. So that may be an area in the future where there'll be a lot of revenue potential. Minnesota almost passed something last year, which would have brought in a whole lot of money by sort of saying, that money that's on that's in Bermuda or something like that that you're saying is in Bermuda can't escape taxation.
Wow, I have to say, that's very exciting.
It is. It is.
Super exciting. And on that note, I want to thank all of our listeners. Phineas, I want to thank you so much for coming on here today, and also just for the work that you and the Mass Budget and Policy Center do. It's really incredible. We couldn't do all of this without you. And everyone, we appreciate you being here, and we look forward to chatting with you all next week. Hey there, thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe, and it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.